This video is an introduction to Madeline Hsu's book, The Good Immigrants: How the Yellow Peril Became the Model Minority. Madeline Hsu is a history and Asian American studies professor and author at the University of Texas at Austin. Her book, The Good Immigrants, tracks the immigration history of Asians to the U.S. and provides insights into the evolution of Asian Americans from the Yellow Peril to the model minority. The perception of Asian Americans is not only important to look at from a retrospective angle, but also from a present angle. It is imperative to think about topics like this because the social climate in the U.S. is fluid. The way the dominant culture views racial minorities fluctuates on a situational basis. Looking at the current state of racism towards Asians and Asian Americans in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic is proof of that. Before getting into the text, let's start with some definitions. The Yellow Peril refers to the existential fear that Western civilization is in danger from the influence and influx of Eastern Asian peoples. This was used in the late 19th century to depict East Asians as barbaric, immoral others come to take the jobs of white Americans. The model minority myth is the perception that members of a certain minority demographic group achieve higher levels of socioeconomic success compared to other minority groups. So, for example, the stereotype that all Asians are smart and become doctors is a part of the model minority myth. It's important to note that despite the seemingly favorable perspective of the model minority myth, it is not necessarily a healthy viewpoint. For one, it establishes racist stereotypes for Asians and puts many Asian Americans in a box. Two, it inherently disregards the social issues and struggles that Asian Americans have faced in the past and currently face in the present. And three, it pits different minority groups against one another, indirectly shaming non-Asian minorities as being quote-unquote problem minorities. So how did this shift from the Yellow Peril to the model minority happen? Well, Hsu's stance is this. Looking at Asian immigration history from a selective lens instead of a restrictive lens provides a way to track the general representation of Asians in America. Historically, the majority of scholarship on Asian immigration in the U.S. has been seen through a restrictive lens, meaning that we tend to focus on the certain characteristics of immigrants that the U.S. government wanted to keep out rather than let into the country. But Hsu emphasizes the selective aspects of immigration laws because it gives us a clear idea of how the preferred traits of immigrants ultimately shaped the way Asians are viewed in the Western world. In Hsu's words, it's important to think about not only the gates barring entry to unwanted persons, but also the gateways that permitted admission to peoples deemed assimilable. The concept of the assimilable migrant is foundational to the views that influenced the immigration laws. In the mid-1800s, many Chinese migrated to the U.S. in search of economic opportunity. The majority of these migrants were unskilled laborers, meaning they found jobs which did not require much, if any, specialized skill or experience, such as working in manufacturing, agriculture, and construction. Because of this influx of unskilled Chinese laborers, Chinese migrants were labeled unfree heathen coolie laborers, undermining the white working-class family men through unfair economic competition. As such, they were also deemed unassimilable because they were a threat to the American economy. In 1882, in response to the backlash against Asians, Congress passed an act to execute certain treaty stipulations relating to Chinese, which would later be termed the Chinese Exclusion Act, in order to limit the entry of Chinese laborers. The goal of the Chinese Exclusion Act was to halt all Chinese immigration to the U.S., but with a few exceptions. Looking at this policy from a purely restrictive lens, we see that the U.S. wanted to bar the immigration of the Chinese working class. However, as Hsu points out, there were certain exempt classes, including students, merchants, merchant family members, teachers, tourists, and diplomats. Now, looking at the Chinese Exclusion Act with a selective lens, we see that the types of people the U.S. did allow to immigrate were ones that would be most likely to benefit the American economy and society, paving the way for the emergence of the model minority. According to Hsu, these exemptions demonstrated the possibilities of cultural convergences between Chinese and Americans could welcome and economically benefit from the presence of the right kind of Chinese, educated, westernized, well-mannered, and possessed of practical skills and talents. To the American public, students, merchants, and diplomats, unlike their working-class counterparts, were assimilable. Students in particular were seen as malleable. The previous generations of unskilled coolie laborers caused Americans to believe that the Chinese were a danger to Western civilization, taking jobs and sending money back to China. This mindset led to the rise of Yellow Peril and the establishment of harsh restrictions on Chinese immigration. But for the select few who were allowed immigration rights, a new age of Asian American perception arose. With the acceptance of only educated and professional individuals, Chinese Americans began to be equated with a greater opportunity for socioeconomic success. At first, it was believed that these groups of selected Chinese immigrants would only be temporary presences. Students would come to be educated in the American higher educational system and then return to China for work. However, as time passed, many Americans began to see the benefits provided by these groups, looking at their contributions to the fields of technology, science, and engineering. Thus, with the growth of the American economy and global competition in mind, Americans learned to accept Asians into their fold and started to see them not as the coolie laborers of the past, but as the model minority, an example to other minorities that success is possible if one simply conforms and benefits the dominant culture. So why is it important to talk about Asian American history and specifically immigration history today? Well, history does not exist in a bubble. It directly affects the way we experience culture, society, and politics now. As such, there is a clear importance to the topic today. With the current COVID-19 pandemic, hateful attitudes towards Asians all over the world is at a peak. Beliefs that all Asians, not even just Chinese, carry the virus and are purposely spreading it lead to hate crimes and discriminatory practices on a global scale. It took generations for the directly racist attitudes against Asians and Asian Americans to mold into the model minority, but it takes only a matter of weeks for that to regress back to the Yellow Peril. So by shedding light on the struggles of the past, we validate the struggles of the present and hopefully mitigate the struggles of the future.